Hi, everybody. I am thrilled to be here with you. My name is Nicole Kraft. I am an associate professor of clinical communication here at The Ohio State University. I am a professor in journalism specifically, and it is my great privilege to be able to be here with three extraordinary people who all contribute to journalism in ways that we can only imagine and I desire to emulate daily. So I'm also the director of the Sports and Society Initiative here at Ohio State, and we have co-sponsored this event with Dr. Reddy, and we are thrilled, and of course with John Draper. So thank you so much for allowing us the privilege of being here with you. And I would like to introduce our panel, starting off with my very good friend Vince Doria, who of course is the if you don't know, but he is the chair of the Sports and Society Board, a veteran of ESPN News and so many other wonderful things in your program. So Vince, welcome. We are thrilled that you're here with us. Just come off mute for us. The proverbial Zoom.
How about now?
That's perfect. Awesome.
All right. How you doing?
And then Alison, I'm going to go alphabetically. Sorry, Sarah, I'm sure this happens to you all the time. And then my very good friend, Alison Lukan, who I'm not sure if she's in Columbus or Seattle, but she, of course, has been the voice, the face, the numbers of the Seattle Kraken. So super excited that she could join us amidst of the NHL season. Welcome, Alison.
Hello from Seattle.
Oh, yay, lucky you. And then certainly not least, Sarah Ziegler, who is here from FiveThirtyEight. So if we need to talk anything about reporting with data, I don't know how we could do that without FiveThirtyEight. So thrilled that you could be here with us too, Sarah.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, I'm going to start. I warned Vince I was going to start with him, and I do want to start with him because there has been numbers in sports ever since the first ERA was recorded. My mentor, Harvey Pollack, invented plus minus in the 50s or 60s, whatever that was. And at that point, it was super sophisticated. I remember charting plus minus in the 80s and thinking we were sophisticated. Vince, how have we gone so far, so fast from kind of this core number that we needed to sort of embrace sports to now this explosion of data being kind of important in the coverage that we provide?
Well, probably a lot of it is simply because of the environment now with the internet, social media, and so forth. So many platforms are there to avail yourself of data. That really wasn't the case back when you and I are talking about. I'm old enough to remember working with Harvey Pollack, actually. So it was a long time ago. At ESPN, where I worked, and I can probably best talk about the background of it. There was a fellow named Ed Macedo, who's not a household name. Don't often hear about him in relationship to ESPN, but he was really the first visionary about sports analytics at ESPN. He was an editor on the news desk. He came from a print background. He worked in West Coast, primarily San Jose, Seattle. And in 2003, he was given by John Walsh, who's an iconic figure in the history of ESPN, came there also with a print background in the late 80s and essentially reinvented SportsCenter. He gave Ed a copy of Moneyball, the Michael Lewis book, which they're all familiar with. And it wasn't because Ed was essentially a numbers geek. He was familiar with statistics, as any sports fan is, and so forth, but he was an Oakland A's fan. So John gave him the book. And, he read the book and he was really influenced by it. And this is, for anybody listening that doesn't know, Moneyball by Michael Lewis basically chronicles the story of Billy Beane and the Oakland Athletics, a small market team that did not have the financial resources of the Yankees, Red Sox, Cubs, Dodgers at all, and built a team basically through data-based evidence and analytics, and a very successful team. So Ed read the book, and what struck him, and Ed was a journalist and a storyteller, what struck him about it was not so much the minutiae of the numbers, but the use of analytics as a storytelling device, the potential to make stories better, more accurate, more thorough, and he really embraced that idea. And as a couple of years went along, more and more of us at ESPN began to see that professional sports primarily, certainly baseball, followed by the NBA, eventually the NFL, were starting to use something called sports analytics to build their teams, to assess talent, and so forth. And increasingly, the idea grew among a lot of people. If this is what teams were doing, we better bring this to the fans and let them know about it. And so in 2006, we created a sports and information department and put Ed in charge of it. We'd already had a research department, and we essentially folded that in eventually to the sports and information department. And Ed was given headcount to begin bringing in some people with sports analytic backgrounds. Dean Oliver was a prime example, who had worked in Seattle and really had brought database decision-making to the NBA. Several people like that came along and began creating this basically, database of sports analytic so-called information. And it wasn't necessarily an easy sell at ESPN in the early days. The digital side, primarily ESPN.com, embraced it. They were more text based, obviously, used to dealing with more data, charts, so forth. Television side, not so much. Television side was driven by video, fast-paced video, quick segments, and so forth. And heavily text information wasn't necessarily something easy to digest on television. But in time, both sides learned some things. And one of the things that the sports information guys learned is that you need to create graphics that were short, concise, to the point, quick, that you can get it out, and relevant, and provided context. Not always an easy case, but they began to do a remarkable job at it. One summer, Trent Dilfer, the former NFL quarterback, spent practically the entire summer with the sports and information group, where they had, gotten into the notion of granularly looking at plays, formations, and so forth to, determine tendencies. And he taught them a lot about this, and they were able to extrapolate that and present it as data-based information. And so eventually shows started glomming onto it. What helped, frankly, there were a couple people on the advertising side that started selling it as sponsored elements, in which case the show producers had no choice. And those of us on the news side were more receptive to that, where there was always a tendency to want to hold advertisers and sponsors at arm's length on journalistic-based material, investigative material, enterprise material. Data-based material was different. It didn't look like material that could necessarily be influenced by advertisers. It was fact-based. It was there for what it was. So if you wanted to call it the low spray chart here or something in baseball, we were all okay with that. And, that helped drive it too. And frankly, it just went from there and grew and grew. And now it's a basic part of SportsCenter, of any ESPN show. Certainly on the digital side, it's heavily used. There was, as Sarah knows, there was a partnership with FiveThirtyEight that actually started with the 2010 World Cup, and, brought data. Soccer was bereft of any really good data in those days, and it brought data to an American audience that was conditioned to look for statistics and so forth and how they consume sports, and made the World Cup perhaps more palatable to them. So I'm not going to go on here forever because I'll take up your whole 45 minutes here. But anyhow, that's sort of how it all got started.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. Sarah, I got into journalism because I don't do numbers. Like we always joke about that journalists don't do math. And I can't say that anymore. So can you help us see, how this has evolved, this integration with journalism? And of course, FiveThirtyEight is so synonymous with analytics and with helping us understand really grand circumstances through analytics. What is the philosophy that you guys are bringing to the table in terms of sports coverage?
Yeah, well, it is funny that every journalist says that. I was the treasurer of a journalism board, and I always thought the best way to get in that kind of a leadership position is to go for treasurer, because no journalists want to deal with counting. It's like the secret way in as a journalist. But for journalists we're storytellers, we're explainers, right? We want to explain the world around us to anyone who will listen, and even some people who won't. And so when it comes to sports, really data is essential. And I think anyone who covers sports already is doing data in some capacity. If you talk about a batting average, you're talking about, you're using statistics. Now we've gone, past batting average now, but it's the same concept and it's just finding a better way to explain what we're seeing, which I really love. I mean, I think there's still lots of room in sports journalism for the anecdote, right? The story of the player and the background there and the personal connections. Absolutely. I love that stuff. You will see me cry to, videos of players doing something wonderful all the time. But then we want to tell at 538, we focus on the non-anecdote, the bigger picture, where we can see the trends throughout a sport and trying to find better ways all the time to explain what's going on, which I think is really exciting and fun. And it doesn't take away from the sort of more traditional journalism there. Data journalism in sports, I think, is very easy because it is sports so obviously already.
Absolutely. I do want to remind everyone before I put Alison on the hot seat here, that the Q&A is open, and we absolutely want this to be a conversation between you and these extraordinary people that we've brought together. I'm lucky enough to get to talk to most of them quite a bit. So I want you to please submit your questions early and often. We definitely want to hear from you. Alison, who of course is now the face and the voice of the Seattle Kraken, in no small part because of your extraordinary gift with data and with your analytical mind and your ability to converge journalism and analytics. And so maybe you can kind of break down for us what you think analytics brings to sports coverage.
Yeah, I think Sarah hit on what I think is so important is that we have used numbers for forever. And sometimes I'm starting to kind of hate, in a way, the word analytics, because if you said to a coach or if you said to a reader, do you want more information on your team? The answer, of course, would be yes. And as Sarah illustrated so nicely, we are getting better information. That's all this is better information. And so, I think that's what's really key to bringing analytics in. My reason to go into analytics was about why. I needed the why. And, I think I always tease about the standard highlight. You see a great goal, but you don't see the pass before the goal, and you don't see the takeaway before the pass, and you don't see this and that. When it comes to bringing analytics in, it's communication that is such the key. And you and I talk about this all the time, Nicole, is finding the language that resonates with who you're talking to, be that a coach, be that a reader, be that whomever, and speaking in that language to bring the data to life.
No question. Well, maybe you can segue us into, what is hot in information now? What are people looking for? And I'm sure there's been an evolution of the kind of data and analytics and expectation and information that people are seeking from from coverage.
Yeah, what is hot is an interesting question, because I think, at least in hockey, what we're seeing is a great divergence here, is that what is hot is one of two things. It is either descriptive, think betting, think who's the fastest skater on the ice. Okay, well, that's interesting, and maybe that's a prop bet for you, but does that tell us anything? Is that predictive? So there's descriptive and predictive, and I think there are things that are hot in both categories right now in terms of the data. In terms of the type of data that's really hot, and some sports are farther along in this than others, is the idea of player and whatever item you're using. In hockey, it's a puck. In other sports, it's a ball tracking. Because so much of what we're getting so much of what we're able to do with analytics is limited by the data we can get. And there's only so much that is coming in an automated way, in a quick way, in a real time way, versus things we have to go back and watch the game and manually record who passed this, where were they, what happened, that kind of thing. So when we can get tracking data, in theory, we get a data-based version of everything that's happening on a field or on a sheet of ice or on a pitch. And that, I think, is going to lead to the next set of questions that we can answer. Again, other sports are farther along in this, but I know that's very much front of mind, particularly in the hockey space.
Absolutely. Sarah, would you help us see the same question from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's such an exciting time to be in sports data or sports analytics, because there are so many questions that we have that we're starting to finally get answers to. In NFL, defense is notoriously difficult in football in general, NFL, or, defense is notoriously difficult to measure because a guy who's getting a lot of interceptions is being thrown at, right? So the best guys they're not being thrown anywhere around. So how do you measure that? And you can try to measure where a quarterback is throwing the ball. We just had a story on the site about Kayvon Thibodeau for Oregon. Sorry to bring up Oregon at an Ohio State conference.
We'll get over that.
I should have thought that through. But he doesn't have great numbers. And he'll probably be the number one pick in the draft because he has a gravity around him, right? That forces the offense to do things differently. I think when we figure out really good metrics for that, really good ways to measure that, that'll be revolutionary in how we think about defenders. That kind of stuff is really exciting. Space in the NBA. Really, anytime we can talk about space better, and with player tracking data, we're gonna, that's gonna come more and more. But the gravity around players and how that all works in ways that you can't see. You see when you're watching a game, but you can't see in the data. So that I'm really excited about. It's just whole new horizons of ways to explain the games.
Vince, Sarah mentioned, the draft, and it got me thinking about, what the drafts used to be like. They were shorter for one thing, and there wasn't as much reliance on data, and I'm sure GMs didn't have as much data to rely on. And now when you're looking at coverage of something like a draft in any sport, or the kind of data heavy events, how do you balance being data heavy but yet still appealing to people who maybe tuned in and they weren't as entrenched a sports fan as maybe people who are now looking for the kind of data that real entrenched sports fans might be looking for?
Well, if you're delivering that information on television, which is primarily where I worked the last 23 years of my career, personality has a lot to do with it. The way Mel Kiper Jr. presents his draft information in this yada, yada, yada staccato presentation or something, as an appeal to fans and so forth. And hopefully they're listening and gleaning the information also. But yeah, you have to figure out ways to deliver it, at least on television, in a way that's palatable. You just can't put up panels of information and so forth and expect people are going to stay there on their screens and read it. So, the personality of how it's delivered, the context of how it's delivered, the presentation of it, can you deliver it with video-based examples and so forth, for instance. Things like that are always going to be important in delivering analytics, to a television audience. I think what I see now, and of course, people are way ahead of it, way further ahead of it than I am, but the marriage of analytics to the burgeoning wagering environment in sports. Betting was, for years, as heavily resisted by the sports leagues. The NFL decried its existence, even though it was a primary, motivator for people to follow the league in many cases and so forth. Now, every league has a betting partner. Sports wagering is becoming increasingly legal, all over the country. Professional gamblers have used advanced analytics for years. It's how they make a living. And, I think as wagering proliferates, is, widely available to the public, I don't know if it's a good thing or not, but it's a reality. I think analytics are going to become even more important, because it's one thing to consume statistics as a fan. If you're going to bet money on certain outcomes and so forth, you want, as both Sarah and Alison said, the best information you can get. And if advanced analytics is one of the ways to get that, I think gamblers many obviously have already embraced it. As more people come into this environment, and there will be that, I think you'll see, more embracing of it, I guess.
Absolutely. Well, we have, I think it's a good segue to William's question about identifying the broadcast individuals who do the best job of explaining sports data to the audience. You mentioned Mel Kiper. Vince, anybody else come to mind for you that you really feel stands out in their ability to convey the numbers to an audience?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know if there's any. Carl Ravitch is a broadcaster at ESPN who has embraced it and will cite analytics frequently in delivering baseball information. so forth. He, I think, is the anchor that has embraced it best up there. There are some players who, Tim Legler is one who has embraced it to a certain extent in basketball, I think, and uses it in delivering information, but you have to, with all of this, you have to pick and choose what you're using. It can't be just a long, full graph of statistics and so forth. It has to be that one statistic that, that means something. I think there is still, there use of analytics in ways that sometimes don't necessarily inform you to the degree that you would hope for. When I say this, probably Sarah and Alison will tell me why I'm wrong, and they're probably right. But I'm not a big fan of win probability. You'll see this frequently used in games. Football team is up 14 points with the ball in their possession in midfield, and the opponent has only one timeout left. There's 4 minutes left in the game or something. Their probability of winning this game is 93%. I don't know what that means. As a football fan, I'm pretty sure they got a real good chance of winning this game. I don't know if it's 93, 89, 97, maybe it's 84. I'm not sure, but it doesn't really, to me, mean anything. Now, others may see it differently. And I suppose in the world of in-game wagering, if that's going on, maybe it means something at that point. If you can get shorter odds than the 92%, okay, I get it. But that's pretty much of a niche audience right now. Maybe it'll grow. Anyhow, my take on it.
I gotcha. Sarah, who stands out for you?
One of my faves is Mina Kimes on ESPN. I think she does a great job of she thinks, she talks about stats and has great fluency in there and is, still wildly entertaining. I think sometimes when some of us who are deep in analytics talk about it, it's pretty dry. And so I think that's the key to have a lot of personality to and make that work. To Vince's point about win probability, I think that's a funny thing because at FiveThirtyEight we deal a lot in probabilities, and we have discovered that people don't understand that all that well. When you have a say, I don't know, 30% chance of winning, I don't know, a presidential election, maybe, what that means is not clear to people often. And so talking about that in different ways, I think, is important, because that's the key. If people don't understand it, then it's really not useful, right? And so I've often wondered if we shouldn't say win probability. We should say, 93% of teams in this situation through all of history have won, and take it more in that percentage instead, or more in that approach, instead of this team has a 93% chance of winning. Because that, you're right, Vince, what does that mean? I don't know. They're probably going to win. Sure. I don't know.
Who knows? Yeah. Well, Alison.
By the way, I will, I failed to mention Nina, and I should have. I mean, she's terrific. And, she,
Absolutely.
Look, the viewership of ESPN has always been heavily male, no surprise. Okay. And to sit there and see the kind of information come out of Mina to a lot of a male audience, okay, is eye-opening. All right. And maybe it shouldn't be, and maybe there's some sexism in that view, but males are used to getting their sports information from males. Okay, that's how it kind of has been forever. And to see Mina have the kind of, someone who never played football, who never coached it and so forth, have the kind of grasp that she has of the information and her ability to deliver it in an engaging manner, that hits on all cylinders, really.
Absolutely. Well, speaking of an engaging manner, Alison, who stands out for you?
Well, I'm trying to do it.
All right, we're going to get to that in a second.
I think in the hockey space, two names that come to mind for me right away are Dominic Moore, who's just been brought on with ESPN. He was with NBC prior. And then I think of Mike Johnson, who does work with NHL Network and TSN up in Canada. And, for me personally, here's my thing on win probability. I believe in it. But to Sarah's point, when I'm describing something that leads to win probability, I'm not throwing out those numbers. I'm saying they did this, and that makes it more likely that they will X. I think sometimes we veer too much to the space of specificity versus the space of education and what trends are versus the exact percentage points.
Absolutely. Well, Alison, you have this, your challenge is unique. You are so gifted, speaking of people who entertain and provide information, no one does it better than you. But you're dealing with an audience that doesn't know anything, a lot of them, about the subject that you're talking to them about, brand new team in a brand new market. How do you balance those two things of how much data you need to provide people versus just bringing your personality and the personality of the team to them?
I must give credit to the Seattle Kraken organization and to Rootsports Northwest, who is our TV broadcast partner, who I work with also. They have both done an incredible amount of preparation in terms of understanding what our fan base looks like. Because there has been junior hockey here and there was professional hockey many, many, many years ago. So you have a very broad spectrum of fans in terms of their knowledge of the game. But what you have, and that's very interesting, is that you also have a very deep underlying theme of data-driven thinking. I mean, obviously Amazon is here. You have a very intellectual part of this fan base. And so selfishly, I've benefited and applaud from the fact that both the organization and the network have challenged us to deliver our education and our analysis of the game in a data-driven way, which I really like. And so when we are talking about, for example, breaking down a goal on the broadcast, as I just said, we are talking about, do you see this kind of pass? That kind of pass is so valuable because it does this to the players, but we also know that that kind of pass is more dangerous and is more likely to result in a goal. So and I really appreciate it, because while this speaks to something Sarah said earlier, the reason we watch sports is the magic of it. Probability can tell us everything in the world and we never know what's going to happen. That's why we love it. But I really appreciate and enjoy and am proud of the fact that we are really grounding our education in a data-driven way, in an informed way. And because we're marrying video, the written word, and the data, I feel like we're still, hopefully for the most part, able to satisfy all those different spectrums of our fan base. And we're hearing from them, at least right now, that they appreciate it and they enjoy it. And that even if they know the game, they're learning about data. And even if they understood data, they're learning about hockey. So that's kind of how we balance it, is by bringing this data-driven focus. So maybe you know the sport, but not data. Maybe you know data, but not the sport. Marrying those, we keep it compelling and interesting, hopefully, for everyone who's taking our content in.
Definitely. Just a gentle reminder, everybody, we still want to get your questions in, so please submit them. We don't, it's just really important. We want to hear from you, and we know that you must have questions, so please give us the opportunity to present them to these incredible panelists. I do have one question that kind of dovetails nicely with the question that I had. So Ryan's asking about, for you, Sarah, if the sports editor, you feel like you have to keep math nerds in check, and how you would frame that to your 538 writers. And I was going to ask the question similarly of, what are some of the potential challenges of being too data heavy?
I'm not sure we do keep the math nerds in check, although maybe we should be doing that. I think it's always really important to see the humanity in the players and not reduce people to lines on a spreadsheet. I think that can be easy to not to, it's not that you consciously are doing that, obviously. It's just that, like, when you're looking at data, it's data points and not necessarily the people behind them. And so people can fall into traps of talking about players as assets instead of like people. That happens a lot around trade deadlines or free agent signings or whatever. And it's like, it's a person. Let's be careful about how we're talking about this, this trade chip who's a real person with feelings. And so I think that's really important to like bring back some of that humanity. So we're talking about trends, we're talking about data we see, but like we're also talking about these amazing feats from real people that we're seeing on the field or on the court or on the ice. And I think there's so much room for storytelling and doing both of those things, telling great stories while incorporating data. They don't have to be separate at all. They should be melded together, and that's going to bring you the best story, I think.
Vince, are you seeing there's any challenge in terms of being too data heavy? Are we losing anything from our our kind of core sports coverage?
I don't know. I don't know that that's true. That's an easy enough conclusion to come to, I guess. But again, I think increasingly, I certainly know on the television side, and I believe on the print side too, where I worked for 20 years, people have looked for ways to present this information in a palatable way, that it's not just throwing stuff up there, expecting people to read a text-heavy graph or something. I think increasingly they figured out ways to package it and present it, and it makes certain sports. Baseball is interesting, which is probably the most. There probably has never been any sport with less action and more statistics. When you think about, and I'm a big baseball fan, okay? So let me say that from the outset, although I think if someone invented the game today, it'd be a hard sell. But when you think of how many statistics are generated by one pitch, one swing, and not only, the traditional ones, the strike, the ball, the hit, total extra base hit, home run, and so forth. We've got spray sheets, of locations. We've got launch angle. We've got exit velocity and so forth. All of that, dozens and dozens of statistics being generated. That's just on the hitting side. There's an equal number being generated at the same time on the pitching side, all out of a transaction that takes about a second or two in many cases. And, I find myself increasingly, I'm not watching baseball as much, but I follow it through the numbers. Okay. And of course, fantasy games have caused proliferation in this area, have increased. I think everybody acknowledges, but I think have increased popularity for baseball and the NFL, particularly in ways beyond what's being acknowledged. I think there are, people ask people, who do you root for in the NFL? Increasingly, people are rooting for their fantasy team. Okay. And I think, it's simply, and all that is basically a generation of numbers. You assess a quarterback, you say, well, how can this quarterback be better than him? He's on a losing team. He'll throw the ball a lot this week. They're gonna put together numbers, and this has become a big factor in how people follow sports. And and it's not that the traditional manner of following your team or your favorite player doesn't exist. Of course it does, and it's still the driving factor, I think. But increasingly, not to put too fine a point on it, the generation of voluminous numbers is increasing fans of that particular kind of development.
I totally hear you. Well, that leads perfectly into Benjamin's question, which is, and I'm going to throw this to you, Alison, how do people trying to communicate about data and analytics stop ourselves from being too technical? And he acknowledges that sometimes people ask technical questions about a metric, and unpacking that can be really hard.
Yeah, and I think Sarah and her audience and what she does speaks to this, is that depending on what is important to you to communicate, there are different spaces for your writing or your communication method, whatever that might be. There are spaces that want that technical rigor, that want that in-depth exploration of your model or your process or your sample. And that is acceptable. That work is valid. That work is necessary. And there is going to be a time and a place that is going to need to be explained. And all of that to say, what's most important in that is that you need to understand it. You have to go through the rigor so you understand what you found. Now, that point is made because you have to know your audience. So if you're writing to a technical audience, go. Be there, do that, do the thing. If you are writing for a newspaper, if you are writing for an online site, if you are on a broadcast, you need to know your audience. If you are interviewing players, coaches, you need to know your audience. I bring this example up all the time. It's one of the first analytics-based stories I ever wrote. There's a stat in hockey called shot assists. It's the pass that leads to the shot. I did not walk into the locker room to the player who was leading in that and say, hey, you lead in shot assists. How do you think about that? How do you do that? That doesn't resonate. What I say to the player, because I take the time to understand the work, is I say, you seem to have a really strong knack for putting the puck on your teammate's stick in a place where they can take a shot. Why? What goes into that? And exploration questions there. And then I would go to the coach and I would say, this player does this thing very well. Is that valuable to you as a coach? Do you place value on that? Is that something you advise your players to do? When, where, how? So I've taken the concept and I've turned it into language that my audience understands. And then when I write it or I talk about it on the broadcast, I say, like we were talking about earlier, we know that it is valuable when a player is able to create shots for his teammates by putting the puck on his stick. This player does that really well, right? So I had to have that technical understanding. But what I did was I read it, understood it technically, understood that I could defend it. This is very important. Don't just take in any advice, any stat just as a rule. I understand it, and then I have to be able to translate it to the people I'm communicating with appropriately. And again, please understand, I get it. We put so much effort into this mathematical rigor. You want to say, look at what I did, look at this thing, but you sometimes have to pull back. And I think the only other thing I'd say on this, I don't want to talk too much on it, is that sometimes we end up taking ourselves, because of our passion for this, down a rabbit hole where you're explaining a lot of things. And on that, I advise, if you're explaining a lot of things, stop. Maybe each of those points you're explaining is a different story. So instead of the player who's good at shot assists and good at passing and good at goal scoring and good at faceoffs and all the math behind that potentially, today we're going to talk about shot assists, right? And tomorrow we're going to talk about goals, and break it out so that your time, your communication time isn't spent. You have to explain, but it's not completely explaining. It's to that storytelling space.
Absolutely. Sarah, we have a really interesting question, and I'd love for all three of you, but I'd love you to get us started. There's decision making by the coaching staff is driven by media and public perception of what they should do, rather than using the best statistical evidence available given that game situation. So how do you see the public perception of statistics and data-driven decisions in sports changing how they understand how the game is played?
That's a great question. And actually, I feel like things are changing in that world. So, a lot of times we criticize NFL coaches all the time for playing to lose less instead of playing to win, and you see this year that more coaches are going for it on fourth down, more coaches are going for 2 instead of kicking the extra point. So it feels like maybe that I'm going to lose by less is going away. There was a great game the Lions played against the Rams where they just onside kick, fake punt, just going for it so that they were trying to win instead of just lose respectively. The World Series had another great example of that I thought was really interesting compared to last year. So in game 3, I want to say the Braves took out their starting pitcher who was pitching a no-hitter through 5 innings. Mm-hmm. Crucially, he was not pitching well. Half of his pitches were balls. He was pretty wild. It wasn't a perfect game. He had several walks and a hit batter, I believe. But a no-hitter, right? And that's, we love no-hitters in baseball. But Brian Stinker took him out. And that was the right analytical decision. But there were some, traditionalists who didn't like it and were a little bit, there wasn't that much complaining though. There was some, but not too much. What he said, what Brian Stinker, the Braves coach, said was he went with his gut, but his gut matched analytics, which I think is perfect. And so maybe we can see that changing. A same situation happened in the 2020 World Series when the Rays manager Kevin Cash took out Blake Snell after 6, I think, of 1 hit ball. Now Snell was pitching much better than Anderson was pitching this year, but that decision didn't work out, which is, I think, the big difference also between those two things. That decision got a lot more heat than this year's decision did. And I feel like that shift is sort of happening. Again, it's a little complicated by the fact that one of them won and one of them lost. But I do feel like people are more used to that and are taking it in publicly. And because I think the question is correct. I think coaches do go by what the public thinks. So if the public understands that kind of decision making a little bit better, then maybe coaches will be okay with going for it. I think that we're seeing that from some coaches.
That's a great point. Benjamin also asked, and maybe you can help us with this, Vince, how close are we to having something like the StatCast broadcast on ESPN for all sports?
Maybe close. I'm not directly involved, and obviously I've been retired for 7 years, but I hear things and talk to people. I think that's entirely possible. I mean, as I say, people are following some sports simply by following the numbers. In many cases, baseball is a great example. And I think, I think as you see, particularly with things like the Super Bowl and the college football championships, where ESPN is creating multiple telecasts, ways to present that game. You have a choice of 6 different ways to watch it if you want or something, StatsCast, and they're already doing some of that, so you're definitely going to see more of that. I was interested in Sarah's point about removing the pitcher at the no-hitter. I mean, it's interesting how the handling of pitching has changed, and it's basically an analytics-based process and so forth. I mean, of course, for many years, pitchers were looked upon by judging their wins, losses, and saves, which are not real statistics. They are contrived statistics based on whether you pitched 5 innings or whether there's, one man on base when you come in. The save definition has changed about a dozen times in baseball over the years and so forth. And, it's gotten to the point now where, even when you see writers in Cy Young voting and so forth, wins is basically disregarded now. I mean, it's all about the advanced metrics and so forth that are how pitchers are judged. And, I think that's that's probably a good thing. Although, as a fantasy player, I've screamed at a lot of managers for taking a pitcher out after 4 2/3 innings with a 5-run lead. That's, dispiriting, obviously, but it's the way things are rolling right now. And it's probably, the use of relief starters, pitchers pitching, everybody's pitching 1 or 2 innings in the course of a game or something, 3 innings, so forth. You're probably going to see more of that as time goes on, I think. And those are decisions that are basically driven by analytics, I think.
Well, speaking of what we're going to see more of, and we only have about a minute left, Sarah, what's next on the horizon? Where do you see analytics going? And then Alison, I'd love you to have the last word and tell us where you think it's going.
Yeah, I think we're going to get new and more exciting metrics and new uses for analytics that I'm hoping will be more accessible to viewers and fans, so that you're seeing cool advanced stats during a game. I loved it when ESPN started showing the WAR for players on some broadcasts. I thought that was super cool. So I'm really excited for those kinds of things coming up still.
It's awesome. What about you, Al?
Yeah, I think to piggyback on what Sarah just said, I think that our next great barrier is actually outside of statistics, and it's effective communication and presenting this information in a way that fans absorb it, want more of it. That's what's going to drive this acceptance. And it's when people accept it and are passionate about something, that it's not just us in this community trying to push forward innovation. It's almost demanded. And I've had a lot of conversations with people in this space, and I was guilty of it for a long time. We'd say, okay, well, we're all really smart. We're all analytics minds. How do we get better at communication? And we've almost too intentionally separate the two for so long. And I think that's why doing this well in the media, nothing drives me more bonkers than people who don't do it well, but doing it well, bridging that gap and realizing that effective communication is part of being in the analytics space. It's not in addition to, is crucial. And that's what will push us forward.
Outstanding. Thank you so much, Vince Doria, Sarah Ziegler, Alison Lukan. It has been a pleasure to spend a very quick 45 minutes with you. Thank you to everybody who asked questions and who joined us today. We are thrilled that you were here with us. And I'm going to turn this back over to Ryan Ruddy and John Draper.
Love you, Nicole.
Love you, Alison.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, Nicole, Sarah, Alison. Love the discussion about merging the communication with the analytics. I think that's absolutely the next crucial step that we're trying. I know Dr. Ruddy and I are pushing that quite a bit, and I'm sure that I hope we can successfully do that. See you later, Nicole. So here's where we're at for now. So we have 2 more sections left. We have Bill Zito and Rick Spielman. I did get a call earlier today. Bill Zito was involved, was pulled left and right. He was actually on a plane during the call. He is actually not going to be able to be here at his assigned time, but I did get him for a short 20 to 25 minute kind of one-on-one interview. So I do have that recorded. I will play that here. That's the best we can have for now. I mean, the busy schedules that we got, everyone's running around. So I will play that. We'll still take a 15-minute break, and I'll play that at 4:15. After that's done, as Dr. Ruddy referred to earlier, he will be interviewing Rick Spielman. Rick Spielman, the GM of the Minnesota Vikings, he was planning on being here in person, but due to some diseases that may be around, that we needed to make that a virtual presentation as well. But the plan is still for him to be able to take questions as we go through. We'll update you with if anything new that's coming around. We will keep you informed, but for now, we'll just kind of take a break, about 15 minutes, and we'll be back with at least our short video interview with Bill Zito, and hopefully we can get him to join us again when things are a little less crazy for him. So thank you very much.